Jamie Novak hadn't spoken to her mother in almost 3 weeks when the call finally came. It wasn't dramatic, not even confrontational, just a clipped voice message from Diane saying, "I needed to borrow the car. You weren't answering. It's with me now." No context, no apology, no timeline. That was all. Jamie had stared at the phone in disbelief, her first instinct to assume some misunderstanding. But when she stepped outside and saw her parking spot empty, that flicker of disbelief hardened into something colder. Recognition. It wasn't the first time Diane had crossed a boundary, not even the 100th, but this felt different. The car wasn't just transportation. It was the first thing Jamie had bought entirely on her own, a used Tesla Model 3 she had hunted for over 6 months before finally getting a deal through a retired Lyft driver off-market. It symbolized independence, the kind not easily undone. Jamie was 29, a guardianship investigator with the county, someone whose daily life involved exposing abusive conservatorships and protecting adults from financial manipulation. Yet here she was, the target of exactly the kind of personal overreach she spent her career battling. She didn't immediately call back. Instead, she sat in silence on the edge of her unmade bed, staring at the wall of her apartment like it might give her the answer she couldn't name. On the one hand, she knew how this dance worked. Diane would push until Jamie pushed back, then would claim to be the real victim. But this wasn't a talk-it-out offense. This was theft, plain and simple, even if it came dressed in the soft bathrobe of motherly entitlement. Still, she gave it 24 hours. She sent a neutral text. "I need the car back by tomorrow morning. I have work." It was read and ignored. She followed up with a second. "I'm not asking. It's my property." No reply. She checked the Tesla app, her breath catching when it lit up and showed the vehicle active and located. Not in Diane's quiet condo complex near Shoreline, but in a gated suburban home registered under a name Jamie didn't recognize. Strange. She zoomed in, stared at the digital representation of her car nestled in some stranger's driveway, and frowned. Why was her mother there? At first, she thought maybe Diane was house-sitting, but the longer she looked, the less sense it made. The app showed multiple drives logged, short, erratic trips never more than 10 miles, circling parks and local businesses, mostly during late evenings. The car was in use, regularly and deliberately. Jamie tried to remotely lock it, but access had been limited. Her account had been partially restricted. Someone had tampered with the settings. That was when she felt the sting, not just of anger, but humiliation. Her mother hadn't just taken the car, she had changed the rules. Diane was now playing God in a closed-loop system. Jamie wasn't one to overreact. Her work demanded restraint. She had stood in courtrooms where people tried to lie under oath, forged medical documents, manipulated elderly parents into signing over retirement homes. But the common thread in all of them wasn't crime. It was justification. Everyone thought they were entitled. Everyone claimed the moral high ground. And now, watching her mother use her own logic against her, Jamie saw the same pattern unfolding, only this time in her name. The next day, she showed up at the address where the car had last pinged. The gate was locked. Through the iron bars, she could see the car parked neatly beside a rose hedge. A middle-aged woman opened the door, not Diane, and gave her a confused look when Jamie asked for her mother. "Diane, she's not here anymore," the woman said cautiously. "She left this morning. Said something about meeting someone near the botanical gardens." Jamie forced a smile, nodded, and walked away, all while silently updating the tracking log on her phone. Later that evening, Diane finally called. Her tone was breezy, defensive, and unbothered, as though they were mid-conversation and Jamie had simply forgotten her place in it. "You're overreacting," she said. It's not like I crashed it. You barely used the car." I thought we were beyond this kind of drama. Jamie didn't respond immediately. The silence on the line stretched, awkward and taut. Finally, Jamie said, "You took something that doesn't belong to you." There was a long pause. "You're my daughter," Diane replied. "I don't need your permission to borrow what I helped you build." Jamie hung up. The thing was, Diane hadn't helped her build anything. Jamie had worked for years after college, saving every cent while working her way up from a clerk position in the court records office. The car had been bought in full after Jamie won a county grant for her proposed redesign of the adult guardianship intake system. Diane had been nowhere near that process, and yet, as always, she positioned herself as a silent investor of everything Jamie accomplished, emotionally, financially, spiritually. She'd always made herself indispensable in hindsight. Jamie opened the legal portal she usually used for her job and began searching. It felt surreal, researching legal definitions of non-consensual use of property for her own situation. She filed a civil recovery claim, not a theft report but a formal notification of contested property use, under the unauthorized usage of registered vehicle clause. Not a single move was out of emotion. She contacted a colleague in risk assessment, requested a meeting with her union legal rep, and had her insurance policy updated to note vehicle misuse. The app pinged again. The car had moved to a church parking lot 12 miles south. That struck her. Diane wasn't religious. Jamie remembered her mother once joking that churches smelled like mildew and disappointment. But it wasn't a church that stood out, it was what shared the lot, a family therapy center. The realization came like a slow exhale. Jamie didn't know who Diane was meeting, but she could guess the narrative. It would be rehearsed. Jamie was fragile, reactive, unpredictable. The car was just an object lesson in maturity. There'd be no mention of the app, of the lockouts, or of changing the insurance. Diane didn't need to be legally right. She just needed to sound reasonable. Jamie activated valet lock. That feature disabled trunk access and capped the speed limit. She wanted her mother to feel the walls tightening. Then she called for a flatbed tow and scheduled pickup through the authorized vendor from her insurance portal. The request went through. ETA. 2 hours. The car would be towed legally and cleanly from wherever it currently stood. No confrontation. No chaos. Just silence and paperwork. When the tow arrived, Diane had apparently stepped away. The keys weren't needed. Jamie stood by on a video call with the operator as the flatbed team loaded the car. When Diane returned and saw the empty space, she called 9 times in a row. Jamie didn't answer. Instead, she forwarded one email with a subject line: "Formal notification of possession enforcement action." Inside was a PDF copy of the tracking log, the tow agreement, and a digital receipt in Jamie's name. No screaming, no chase, just silence, just control. Earned, not claimed. As Jamie watched the digital map show her car heading toward the city, a strange quiet filled her chest. Not triumph, not relief, just absence. Like something had been disconnected, an invisible cord she'd been too busy to cut until now. And that was only the beginning. The next morning brought an unexpected stillness, the kind that lingers in the aftermath of a confrontation not yet fully detonated. Jamie had barely slept, not from fear, but from the cold, cerebral awareness that something in her relationship with her mother had shifted permanently. She had imagined that after reclaiming the car, Diane would either retaliate or withdraw, retreating into one of her characteristic moods where she played the wounded matriarch, passive-aggressive silence punctuated by guilt-laced voicemails. But instead, the silence was total, No new calls, no emails, no visits. It would have been a relief if it didn't feel like the still water before an undertow. At 11:06 a.m., Jamie received a certified email from an attorney named Robin Lester. The subject line was simple. Vehicle dispute. Client Diane Novak. The attached letter, written in clipped legalese, opened with a preamble that made Jamie's jaw tighten. We are contacting you on behalf of Ms. Novak regarding the unjust seizure of a shared vehicle. Our client asserts partial ownership based on historical contributions and verbal agreements formed during the acquisition and use of said property. Jamie read it twice, then a third time, her disbelief growing colder with each word. Partial ownership, historical contributions, verbal agreements, all of it fabricated. Diane hadn't contributed a cent to the purchase. She had no ownership rights, no co-signature, nothing. The letter continued, insinuating that Diane's temporary custody of the car was part of a long-standing informal arrangement between mother and daughter, and that the abrupt retrieval constituted emotional aggression and damage to Diane's sense of familial equity. Jamie almost laughed at the absurdity. The phrasing was so sanitized it felt sterile, like a therapist had ghostwritten the entire letter using a thesaurus and a bottle of white wine. In legal terms, what had happened to his driveway was completely off the books. Aaron didn't find comfort in that. It confirmed his suspicion. This wasn't negligence or a bureaucratic error. It was intentional. Jamie's attorney, Russell McCown, a seasoned civil litigator with an allergy to melodrama, called her that afternoon. It's vague and intentionally manipulative, he said, his tone dry. But they're not suing. They're provoking, hoping you'll respond emotionally so they can escalate. Don't. He advised a formal rebuttal, straightforward and surgical. Jamie agreed. They drafted a response that outlined the vehicle's purchase, title, insurance, and registration, all in Jamie's name. They included copies of her payment records and the original purchase agreement. Russell ended the letter with a line that Jamie particularly liked. Should your client wish to pursue ownership claims, we recommend she do so through formal court filings, not through vague innuendo and character implication. They sent it, certified. Within minutes of the delivery receipt, Diane called again. This time her voice was sharper. You didn't have to bring lawyers into this. I only wanted to talk, she said, her tone dripping with martyrdom. Jamie didn't respond to the tone, just the content. You contacted a lawyer first, she replied evenly. You claimed ownership of my car. Diane huffed. Because you escalated. You towed it like I was some criminal. I was using it for errands, Jamie. I wasn't joyriding. It's not like you needed it every day. Jamie closed her eyes. You changed the access settings. You disabled my app login. You filed an alternate insurance claim on it. That seemed to catch Diane off guard. She paused. I didn't think you'd see that. And there it was, the root of everything. Diane never thought Jamie would challenge her, at least not effectively. Not legally, not with paperwork. She had always relied on guilt and memory to override logic. She would evoke images of young Jamie sick in bed, Diane staying up late, Diane sacrificing, Diane giving everything. The narratives didn't require truth. They just needed emotional dominance. But this time, Jamie hadn't caved. She had reclaimed the car without yelling. She had used the law. And now, Diane was wounded not just by the loss of control, but by the realization that her daughter no longer lived in her moral universe. Later that evening, Jamie noticed something odd in her email spam folder, an alert from the Tesla app. Someone had attempted to reset the primary user account 3 times. The request had been denied, but it meant that Diane was still trying. Jamie contacted customer support and initiated a primary user lock, a rare protocol that elevated account control to an immutable level. She backed up her data, changed every linked email and password, and placed the car under biometric access only. It felt like building a fortress against your own family, but at this point, Jamie didn't care how it looked. 3 days passed. Then came the certified letter from her insurance provider. The document was thick, printed on glossy paper with far too many footnotes. The opening paragraph was benign, just a policy review notice. But the second page contained the real blow. A second party has requested reassignment of insurance control under Policy Modification Clause 8.3, citing familial co-use. Jamie called immediately. After verifying her identity through an excruciating 5-layer process, the agent explained that Diane had presented herself as a co-driver with vested interest using Jamie's previous home address and a copy of an outdated document, likely the maintenance invoice from last year that had listed Diane's number as an emergency contact. Jamie didn't scream. She didn't swear. She just asked for everything in writing, then filed a fraud alert with the provider and submitted a notarized revocation of all third-party access. She requested a legal barrier on the VIN, prohibiting any future policy changes without direct biometric confirmation. The agent hesitated, saying it was rarely done. Jamie's reply was calm. Rare doesn't mean invalid. The request was approved. Still, the emotional cost was mounting. Jamie wasn't afraid of Diane, not in the traditional sense, but she felt something more corrosive. Exhaustion. The kind of weariness that comes when every memory becomes a liability, when every shared smile is retroactively loaded with debt. Diane wasn't trying to win back the car. She was trying to remind Jamie that nothing she owned was truly hers if Diane could still find the cracks to squeeze through. A week later, Diane left a voicemail at 2:17 a.m. Jamie didn't listen to it immediately. Something about the timestamp made her skin crawl. When she finally played it back, Diane's voice was oddly calm, almost friendly. "I saw your interview on the court blog," she said. "You looked so professional. I'm proud of you." Pause. "But I just wonder, how do you expect to protect other people's rights when you can't even talk to your own mother?" The recording ended there. No goodbye. Jamie sat with the message for a long time. It wasn't angry. It wasn't accusatory. It was worse. It was manipulative empathy, the kind that sounds kind but only exists to undermine. It wasn't meant to start a conversation. It was meant to hollow her out. She deleted the voicemail. Then, without fanfare, she contacted her attorney and instructed him to prepare a cease and desist order, not just for vehicle interference, but for harassment. There would be no dramatic showdowns, no confrontation in the driveway, just cold official boundaries sealed in legal language. Because if Diane wanted to act like a stranger, Jamie was ready to treat her like one. The first thing Jamie did after filing the cease and desist was change her emergency contact. It was something so minor, a bureaucratic footnote in her employment record, yet symbolic in a way that left her breathless. For most of her adult life, Diane Novak had lingered in that space, between obligation and proximity, a name always present in forms, documents, doctor's offices, but rarely consulted in real life. Now, Jamie replaced it with Russell McCown, her attorney. Not a friend, not even someone she liked particularly much, but a man with no emotional leverage over her, and that alone felt revolutionary. It wasn't a declaration of war. It was a quiet reclassification of loyalty. You don't go to war with family. You draw maps where they no longer exist. But wars don't wait for permission. 3 days after the cease and desist was delivered, Jamie found a note taped to the glass front of her apartment building. It was written in neat, practiced cursive on thick stationery, the kind her mother used for Christmas cards and wedding RSVPs. "I never meant to upset you. I just wanted to stay close. I didn't realize how far you'd already gone." There was no name signed at the bottom, but she didn't need one. Jamie stared at the paper in silence before peeling it off and placing it directly into the shredder bin inside the mailroom. Not because she was afraid of what it said, but because she knew it wasn't for her. It was for the building, for the neighbors, for anyone who might see it and whisper. This wasn't communication. It was spectacle. Later that evening, her landlord forwarded an email from another tenant. Apparently, Diane had been seen standing in the parking lot the night before, talking to someone through their car window, gesturing toward the building. The tenant had described her as a little intense, but not aggressive. Jamie wasn't surprised. She called the building manager and requested that Diane be added to the non-visitor list. A formality, yes, but one that allowed security staff to legally escort her off the premises without warning. The manager hesitated at first, clearly uncomfortable. "It's your mother," she said, her tone awkward, like she expected Jamie to explain herself. Jamie simply replied, "And she's trespassing." That ended the conversation. The next blow came quietly, like all the worst ones do. Jamie received a text message from her former violin teacher, someone she hadn't seen in over a year. It was warm at first. "Heard you were in the paper. So proud of you." But then shifted. "Your mom mentioned you've been going through something. If you ever want to talk, I'm around." Jamie sat on the edge of her desk, phone in hand, the air thick with that familiar sensation of being preemptively discredited. Diane was talking, not just to lawyers but to people in Jamie's periphery, quietly framing herself as the concerned parent to anyone willing to listen. That was her style. No direct confrontation, just enough ambiguity to seed doubt. Jamie considered responding, then didn't. Instead, she called Russell and asked what the threshold was for defamation. He sighed. "Legally, pretty high. Unless she's making provably false claims that directly harm your reputation or employment, it's protected speech. But we can document it. Start collecting names, statements, anything that shows she's misrepresenting you to third parties." Jamie nodded, already pulling out a notebook. It wasn't about a lawsuit. It was about keeping record. Because when someone like Diane moved through the world, the damage didn't look like wounds. It looked like rumors. A few days later, Jamie noticed something strange with her credit monitoring app. An alert for a new inquiry. Not a charge. Not a card. Just a background ping from a retail finance agency she didn't recognize. She flagged it immediately and froze her credit, then requested a full audit. The results came back showing someone had attempted to open a department store account using an old version of her address, her former employer listed as the reference, and an email domain registered under JN Consult. Jamie knew that wasn't hers, but she also knew who would have the nerve to think she could get away with it. She brought the report to Russell, who didn't even blink. "This is identity fraud," he said, flipping through the printouts. "Low level, but still actionable. Especially if we can prove she had access to this data from when you lived together." Jamie hesitated. "I don't want to press charges. I just want it to stop." Russell leaned back. "Then you need to show her there are consequences. Not punishment, just barriers. Think of it as psychological fencing." It was a strange term, but it stuck. Jamie took his advice. She filed a formal affidavit linking the attempted credit activity to a breach of prior information. No names were listed, but the intent was clear. She wasn't letting anything slide anymore. Every incident, every manipulation, cataloged, time-stamped, submitted. She even had her employer's security team install a motion-triggered camera on her parking level after noticing scuff marks near her car door one morning. It didn't feel paranoid. It felt necessary, and yet, for all her preparation, nothing stung like the next move. Diane didn't go quiet. She went professional. Jamie received a subpoena notice from a third-party mediation firm. Diane had filed a formal request for arbitrated reconciliation regarding shared property and familial financial obligations. It wasn't a lawsuit. It was worse. It was a forced therapy session dressed in legal robes. Jamie knew the tactic. It was often used by bitter ex-spouses or toxic parents who wanted court-sanctioned access without needing real evidence. And now Diane was using it to reclaim emotional territory. Russell was furious. "This is theatrical manipulation, not legal mediation," he said. "But you'll have to attend. At least once. Then we can refuse future sessions on record." Jamie nodded. She wasn't afraid of the meeting. She just hated that Diane would get to perform. That she'd sit there in a calm sweater set, sipping water, saying things like, "I just don't understand why she's shutting me out," while playing the wounded mother role to some neutral mediator who wouldn't know the history. The session happened on a gray Tuesday afternoon. Diane arrived early as expected, already seated with her folder open and a prepared smile. Jamie entered silently, sat down across from her, and said nothing. The mediator, a polite woman in her 50s, asked if either party wanted to speak first. Diane did. She spoke for 12 uninterrupted minutes about Jamie's pattern of distance, how she had always been a strong-willed child, how Diane only ever wanted to help, how the car had become a symbol of their estrangement. It was eloquent. It was rehearsed, and it was entirely devoid of accountability. When it was Jamie's turn, she didn't speak for long. She simply said, "I reclaimed my own property. I set a boundary. You violated it. Now you're trying to call it a misunderstanding. It's not." The mediator looked between them, clearly uncomfortable. "Would you both be willing to consider family counseling?" she asked gently. Jamie shook her head. "Not if she keeps violating my rights in the name of love." That ended the session. Diane followed Jamie out of the office. Not to scream, not to argue, but to whisper. "You're not the only one who knows how to play the long game," she said. Jamie turned, met her eyes, and said nothing, because she understood. This wasn't about cars. It wasn't about property. It was about control. And Diane had just declared she wasn't finished. Jamie didn't flinch. She just walked to her car, got in, and locked the door with a single finger tap. Quiet, efficient, final. Just like every step she would take from now on. There was a strange stillness in the weeks following the mediation, a deceptive quiet that Jamie recognized from her professional life as the breath before escalation. Diane hadn't called, hadn't sent letters or voicemails, hadn't even attempted to reassert contact through third parties. It would have been easy to believe she'd accepted the outcome and moved on. But Jamie knew her mother too well. Diane didn't retreat. She recalibrated. And when she returned, it was always with a different weapon, never the same tactic twice. So Jamie kept her guard up. She double-checked her car's security settings, removed her name from every publicly available people search engine she could find, even requested her HR department to flag any unusual inquiries about her employment. She wasn't paranoid. She was adapting. Then, in the second week of silence, Jamie received an email from the Department of Motor Vehicles. It was bland, transactional, but the subject line hit like a slap. Confirmation of vehicle title inquiry. Inside was a record of an attempted title search, initiated from an external request using partial ownership justification. Jamie felt her hands go cold as she scrolled through the metadata. The request hadn't gone through. State law required notarized documentation for such access, but the implication was clear. Diane had tried to change the narrative again, this time by testing legal vulnerabilities. Jamie forwarded the email to Russell immediately, and within hours he filed a preemptive hold with the DMV, flagging the VN and her personal information for unauthorized inquiry tracking. It wouldn't stop future attempts entirely, but it would force any future requests to trigger alerts. The following Monday, Jamie got a knock at her apartment door. She wasn't expecting anyone. Through the peephole, she saw a woman holding a clipboard. Not a cop, not someone in uniform. She opened the door crack and asked if she could help. "Hi, sorry to bother you," the woman said, smiling too brightly. "I'm conducting a community satisfaction survey for recent mediation participants." Jamie raised an eyebrow. "You're with the court?" The woman hesitated. "I'm with a private research firm contracted by the Mediation Service. It's all anonymous." Jamie didn't answer. She stared at the badge clipped to the woman's lapel. It looked printed from a home printer. Then she shut the door, slowly, and locked it. She called Russell again. He didn't even try to soften his tone. "This is an escalation," he said. "If she's sending people to your home under false pretenses, we're moving into harassment territory. I'm going to prepare a formal restraining order petition." I'd held off, hoping we could resolve this through boundary enforcement, but clearly she's not responding to soft limits. Jamie agreed. Something had shifted. The previous manipulation, however emotionally exhausting, had been tethered to plausible deniability. But this was surveillance. This was intelligence gathering. And Jamie could only guess why Diane wanted her reactions monitored. The final straw came later that week in the form of a storage unit bill. Jamie hadn't rented any unit. But the invoice came with her name, her email, and her backup phone number attached to it, listed as a co-lessee on a unit 2 towns over. She called the facility pretending to inquire as the co-tenant and confirmed what she feared. Diane had rented a small unit, then added Jamie's name on the documentation, likely forging a signature, and filled it with what the attendant described as old furniture, boxes, personal effects. Jamie knew instantly what Diane was doing, constructing a paper trail. She was fabricating co-ownership again, this time through physical property. It wasn't about the storage. It was about establishing a web of shared assets to justify future claims. Diane didn't need the car anymore. She wanted the story. Jamie drove to the facility and requested to inspect the unit under her legal right as listed co-lessee. Inside, she found a mess. Stacked boxes labeled with both their names, photo albums, damaged chairs, even an old baby blanket she hadn't seen in 20 years. It was carefully curated emotional weaponry, not storage. A stage. Jamie took photos of everything, documenting the setup, then exited without touching a single item. The next day, she submitted a notarized statement denying co-lease intent and filed a fraud report with the facility's management. This moment, standing among curated memories weaponized for manipulation, marked the pivot point in Jamie's understanding. Up to now, she had treated her mother's behavior as aggressive nostalgia, a refusal to let go masked as misguided love. But the storage unit revealed something more chilling. Diane wasn't clinging to the past. She was rewriting it, one object at a time, one record at a time. The note on the car, the therapist's office, the fake surveyor. It was all connected. Diane was no longer just reacting. She was scripting. And Jamie, for the first time, realized she had to stop playing defense. Jamie had always been good at compartmentalizing, a skill honed from years of navigating emotionally charged environments without letting them seep into her own psyche. As a guardianship investigator, she had been trained to maintain emotional distance, to observe and report, to identify manipulation in all its forms while staying legally neutral. But nothing in her professional experience had prepared her for the constant corrosion of personal reality that came with dealing with someone who didn't break rules loudly, but quietly rewrote them. Diane didn't scream. She drafted narratives. She didn't invade. She included. And the slow, meticulous erosion of Jamie's boundaries was becoming something even more insidious than harassment. It was narrative warfare, where truth was optional and implication did the heavy lifting. In the weeks after the storage unit discovery, Jamie had attempted to reclaim control through legal channels. Russell filed the restraining order petition, backed by a detailed affidavit documenting every instance of boundary violation, every fraudulent action, every third-party manipulation. They included screenshots, emails, credit reports, and transcriptions of voicemail recordings, painting a comprehensive picture of calculated interference. Still, they both knew the legal process would be slow. Diane hadn't physically threatened anyone. She hadn't caused property damage. She hadn't crossed the kind of lines that made judges leap from the bench. What she had done was stay precisely within the margins of legality, close enough to provoke, far enough to deny. That strategy escalated when Jamie's workplace was contacted. It wasn't direct. No one filed a complaint or called with accusations. Instead, a package was delivered to the front desk, addressed vaguely to Jamie N., Adult Advocacy Division. Inside was a thick binder labeled Concerns Regarding Ethical Oversight. The receptionist, unsure of what to do, passed it up the chain, until it reached Jamie's supervisor. The content wasn't overtly defamatory. There were no wild claims or criminal accusations. Instead, it was a carefully curated stack of printouts, screenshots of Jamie's social media from years prior, commentary from anonymous blogs discussing boundary ethics and legal guardianship, and printed emails with ambiguous subject lines that made it seem like Jamie had been the one behaving inappropriately. Most damningly, there was a timeline, fabricated, but presented with enough plausible structure to raise eyebrows. Jamie's supervisor, a no-nonsense administrator named Celia Harper, called her in with the binder on her desk. "You're not in trouble," she said immediately, her voice calm but concerned. "But this showed up. I had to look through it." Jamie, already drained from months of strategic defense, took the seat across from her and said quietly, "My mother sent it." Celia blinked. "Your mother?" Jamie nodded. "She's been building this narrative for months. Quietly. Intentionally. She wants to destabilize me in every system I exist in." Celia leaned back in her chair. "Do you have proof?" Jamie pulled out a small flash drive and slid it across the desk. "Everything's on here. Dates, cross-references, communications with my attorney." Celia didn't say anything for a moment, just stared at the drive like it was a landmine. Then she said, "All right, we'll review it, and we'll handle this internally. If it becomes external, I'll call legal." She paused. "But Jamie, I've been doing this for a long time. I've seen a lot of dysfunction. This is something else." That night, Jamie sat in her car outside her apartment complex for nearly 2 hours, unable to go inside, unable to sleep, unable to even drive. She wasn't crying. She wasn't spiraling. She was just frozen. Diane had reached into her job, her livelihood, her professional integrity, not with a bomb, but with a whisper, and Jamie knew, with aching clarity, that this wasn't going to stop until she found a way to change the equation entirely. The breakthrough came in the form of an unexpected ally. Her building's maintenance supervisor, Manuel, knocked on her door one afternoon with something in his hands, a small rectangular GPS tracker. He had found it wedged beneath the rear bumper of her car during routine lot cleaning. "Didn't look like factory," he said, offering it like an offering. Jamie took it without speaking. Her first thought wasn't panic. It was exhaustion. Another intrusion, another layer, another silent message. "I know where you are." Russell immediately filed a police report. Unlike previous incidents, this crossed into criminal behavior. Installing a tracker without consent was a violation of privacy law, especially if done by someone not co-listed on the vehicle title. The police weren't overly optimistic about tracking the device's source. It had no registration, no serial number, but Jamie didn't need confirmation. She knew, and more importantly, the report gave her something she hadn't had before. Leverage. With the restraining order finally set for hearing and the police report submitted, Jamie made her next move. She requested a full forensic review of her vehicle. Not just the tracking system, but the software logs, access history, location pings, everything. She went directly through Tesla's data request portal and invoked her rights under California consumer data protection laws. The result was a 73-page report showing every instance of manual override, remote access, location sharing, and failed login attempts. The timestamps matched perfectly with the days Diane had either appeared in person, sent indirect messages, or tried to reassert control through fabricated claims. Jamie brought this information to the court hearing. Russell presented it as a part of a larger mosaic: Diane's escalating behaviors, her refusal to disengage, her attempts to insert herself through both analog and digital means. The judge listened carefully, flipping through the evidence. When he spoke, his tone was even but stern. "It is rare to see such sustained, calculated intrusion that avoids traditional classifications of abuse, yet clearly demonstrates obsession with control. The court recognizes the cumulative harm and grants the full order of protection for a period of 2 years. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't climactic, but it was definitive." Jamie left the courthouse feeling nothing. No triumph, no peace, just a vacuum. The victory was necessary, yes, and protective, but it came at the cost of accepting that her mother wasn't going to change, wasn't going to reflect, wasn't going to wake up one day and realize the damage she was causing. Diane wasn't confused. She wasn't delusional. She was intentional. And Jamie had run out of explanations to shield herself from that truth. In the following days, Jamie began to dismantle the remaining threads. She pulled every old file from their shared Dropbox folder, one Diane hadn't accessed in years but had likely hoped still existed. She canceled every lingering joint account, utility reference, or insurance beneficiary listing that had once listed Diane's name, even in the most distant backup capacity. She went through her email contacts and scrubbed every thread where Diane had once been copied. Then she sent one final message, not to Diane, but to herself. A simple note archived in a private folder. "This is not your fault, but it is your responsibility to end it." A week after the protection order was granted, Diane sent one last letter. It arrived in a pale envelope, addressed in perfect cursive, with no return address. Inside was a photo, a candid snapshot of Jamie as a toddler sitting in a laundry basket, laughing. On the back, in small writing, were 3 words: "You owe me." Jamie didn't shred it. She didn't frame it. She placed it into a fireproof box with the restraining order, the court transcripts, the data logs, and the police report. Not out of sentiment, out of record-keeping. Because she knew that someday, someone else might need to understand how a mother could slowly weaponize love, how proximity could become possession, and how survival sometimes meant choosing peace over reconciliation. The first time Jamie saw the footage, she didn't know what to make of it. It was security camera footage, Grainy, black and white, the kind that captured more shadows than details. But what stood out was the timing. It was from her building's underground garage, time-stamped at 3:12 a.m. on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after the restraining order had been approved. Diane was there. She was wearing dark clothes, her hair pulled back tightly, her posture low and deliberate. She didn't approach Jamie's car directly. Instead, she moved slowly between parked vehicles, pausing near corners, staying in the blind spots. The building's security system had picked up her presence automatically, but no alerts were triggered at the time. No alarms, no calls. It was only when Jamie requested a periodic audit of footage as part of her ongoing safety protocol that the clip had been flagged. It was undeniable. Diane had violated the order. She had returned, quietly, dangerously, and she had done it in a way that suggested familiarity with the layout, the angles, the timing of patrols. This wasn't an accident. It was infiltration. Jamie didn't panic. She didn't cry. She took the footage straight to Russell and asked what could be done. He reviewed the video in silence, occasionally pausing, zooming in, replaying specific frames. "She's testing you," he said finally. "Testing the system. She wants to see what she can still get away with. Most people don't get this far. Most people stop after a restraining order. But your mother doesn't want resolution. She wants access." Jamie nodded, a tight, clipped motion. "What do we do?" Russell didn't hesitate. "We file for criminal contempt. If the judge sees this, she could be charged with violating a protective order. It won't be jail time, not on the first violation, but it will escalate the consequences." Jamie agreed. This wasn't about punishment. It was about interruption. Diane had crossed a line, again, and now it was time to close the gap legally. But Diane wasn't finished. That same week, Jamie began receiving deliveries, small, seemingly harmless packages left at her doorstep. Each was unmarked, unrequested. The first was a pair of children's ballet shoes. Jamie hadn't danced since she was 10. The second was a folded sheet of music from an old recital. The third, a pack of ginger tea with a sticky note. "For when you're tired." There was no name, no handwriting, but the messages were obvious. Diane wasn't trying to talk. She was trying to haunt. These weren't gifts. They were signals. Reminders that she knew Jamie's life, her routines, her history, intimately and permanently. The psychological weight was immense. Jamie felt watched in her own home, monitored even in the silence. She reported every package, photographed them, filed police reports, but legally they were difficult to act on. There were no threats, no signatures, no forensic evidence that would tie them directly to Diane, even if the implication was clear. Diane had become a ghost, not because she disappeared, but because she hovered just beyond the reach of enforcement, present in ways the law wasn't designed to measure. It wasn't violence. It was presence weaponized. Then came the phone call that broke the stalemate. A woman named Tasha, an old friend of Jamie's from high school, called unexpectedly one evening, her voice tense. "I got a message from your mom," she said. "On Facebook. She asked if I knew how you were doing, said she was worried. But it didn't feel like concern. It felt like something else." Jamie asked for screenshots and Tasha sent them. The message was long, seemingly heartfelt. Diane spoke of Jamie's emotional instability, her tendency to isolate, her inability to sustain relationships. It was the same script, recycled and polished, now aimed at Jamie's friends. But what made this different was the scale. Jamie ran a search and found that Diane had contacted at least 7 people from her social network in the past month. Some she hadn't spoken to in years. The outreach was targeted, calculated, and deeply manipulative. Jamie didn't wait. She filed an amended complaint. Russell submitted the footage, the delivery logs, and the third-party messages as part of a growing pattern of contempt. The judge granted a temporary enforcement escalation, authorizing law enforcement to issue a direct warning and assign a monitoring officer to the case. Diane was formally contacted, warned that any further breach, no matter how indirect, would trigger automatic charges. Jamie knew it wouldn't stop her. Diane didn't operate in reaction to rules. She operated in reaction to boundaries. And boundaries, for Diane, were dares. The true climax came in the most mundane setting imaginable: a grocery store. Jamie had stopped in for coffee and fruit, her guard down for the first time in weeks. The board didn't issue a response. Karen didn't knock on his door. No new signs appeared. The street quieted in that eerie way a room does when everyone's waiting for someone else to speak first. Aaron continued his routine. "Jamie," she said softly, as if surprised. Jamie froze. This was it. The trap. Deanne wasn't allowed within 200 feet. This store was barely 90 from Jamie's apartment. But the encounter was public. The context unthreatening. Diane had picked her moment. Jamie reached for her phone and stepped backward without speaking. Diane didn't follow. She stood still, watched. Then she said something that chilled Jamie more than anything that had come before. "I always knew I'd run into you again. I just didn't expect you to look so hollow." Jamie didn't respond. She didn't give her the satisfaction. She left the cart, walked out of the store, and called the assigned officer immediately. Within 15 minutes, Diane was being questioned in the parking lot. Within an hour, Jamie had filed the final complaint. This time, there was no ambiguity. Diane had breached the distance restriction in person. There were witnesses, there were timestamps, there was surveillance footage, and there was a history. A long, meticulously documented history that now came crashing down with full legal weight. The officer called Jamie later that evening. "We've issued the citation," he said, "and we've informed her that if she approaches you again, she'll be detained." Jamie said thank you. Not because she felt safer, not because she felt victorious, but because, for the first time in a long time, she felt visible. Seen not as a daughter defending herself, but as a citizen asserting her rights. She hung up the phone and sat in silence, staring at the half-empty grocery bag on the counter. No more messages, no more packages, no more shadows in the hallway or strange taps on the glass. Just quiet. And beneath it, a grief she hadn't dared to name until now. The grief of being forced to sever someone who, by all appearances, should have been the person who protected her most. But sometimes the only way to survive is to stop asking why someone hurt you and start asking how you'll make sure they never get the chance again. In the weeks that followed the final citation, the silence that settled over Jamie's life was different. It wasn't the anticipatory quiet that precedes a storm, nor the strategic pause of someone planning their next move. It was the rare, jarring emptiness that comes when a persistent noise, one you've subconsciously adapted your entire existence around, finally ceases. Diane had stopped. No more letters, no more emails, no more mysterious packages or digital shadows in Jamie's accounts. The systems had worked, at least in the most technical sense. The law had drawn its line, and for the first time in over a year, Diane seemed to be standing behind it. But that didn't mean Jamie felt at peace. What she felt instead was something closer to withdrawal. There were no congratulatory moments, no grand emotional relief, no final act of reconciliation or revelation, just days filled with the routines she'd almost forgotten how to fully engage with. Early morning coffee without watching the door, meetings at work where she no longer checked her phone for updates from legal, evenings in her apartment without the quiet dread of finding something waiting on the threshold. She began to notice things that had gone invisible during the months of stress. How her back had stopped aching when she walked. How her inbox was no longer peppered with privacy breach alerts. How her voice, when speaking to others, no longer held that subconscious tremor of always needing to explain herself first. She spent one particular Saturday doing nothing but reorganizing the shelves in her hallway. It wasn't productive, it wasn't necessary, but it felt like reclamation. She boxed up old paperwork, replaced expired emergency kits, and, near the back of one cabinet, found a small journal she hadn't opened since college. Inside were lists of goals she had once written, personal milestones she had imagined for herself long before her life became a series of strategic defenses and legal filings. At the top of one page was a simple line: "Learn how to live in stillness without waiting for impact." It was strange reading it now, not because she had forgotten writing it, but because she never thought stillness would be so disorienting. Peace, she realized, wasn't immediate. It wasn't romantic or cinematic. It was work. It was day after day of making the choice not to look over your shoulder. Eventually, she sold the car, not because she needed to financially, and not because it had lost its value, but because it had become too tangled in everything that had happened. No amount of new passwords or updated systems could remove the sensation that it had once been used as a conduit of control. She listed it discreetly through a private broker, arranged the sale in a neutral location, and handed over the keys without ceremony. Watching it drive away, she didn't feel regret. Only space, a strange, cold liberation that came not from gaining something new, but from releasing something old. She also moved apartments, though only across town. The new place wasn't bigger or fancier, but it was quieter, with no shared underground garage, no narrow hallways where footsteps echoed too loudly. She chose it for its simplicity: open sight lines, clean access points, and a long balcony where she could sit and watch the sun fall behind the skyline. The move wasn't dramatic, and she didn't announce it to anyone but a few close friends. It wasn't about hiding. It was about removing the last visible coordinates from a map that had been used against her far too many times. Work stabilized. Her supervisor, Celia, continued to treat the incident with professional detachment, and Jamie was quietly reassured that her reputation had not only survived, but had in some ways been strengthened. The department began incorporating her experience into internal training about digital harassment and personal security boundaries, using anonymized examples that Jamie had quietly helped draft. It was strange, becoming a case study in a field she had once entered to protect others. But it was also empowering. If survival meant nothing more than continuing forward with integrity, then that was enough. She began therapy again, this time not for crisis management, but for repair. The sessions were slow and often uneventful, filled with long pauses and frustratingly incremental realizations. But there was progress. She started sleeping through the night again. Her jaw stopped clenching during conversations. She even found herself laughing at work, real, involuntary laughter, the kind that had been absent from her life for far too long. On the final page of her notebook, she wrote something simple: "My peace is not a negotiation." It wasn't for anyone else. It wasn't meant as a message. It was a reminder, quiet, firm, and entirely her own. Because in the end, it wasn't about winning or proving her side or getting the perfect legal resolution. It was about reclaiming the right to exist without having to justify her safety, her choices, or her autonomy to anyone, especially not the person who once claimed to love her most. And so she moved forward, not quickly, not dramatically, but steadily, one unremarkable, irreversible step at a time.